The sun was setting over the Arizona desert in 1891 when Thomas McCready wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at the small cabin in front of him. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, searching for a place where his ranch workers could stay during the busy seasons. The cabin wasn't much to look at. The wooden walls had turned gray from years of harsh sun and wind. Some of the boards were loose and the whole thing looked like it might fall apart if someone sneezed too hard. But Thomas wasn't a picky man. He'd been ranching in this rough country for 15 years, and he knew that any shelter was better than none. His workers needed a place to sleep when they were out here tending cattle, and this cabin would do just fine. The previous owner was a prospector named Bill, who'd spent 2 years digging holes in the nearby hills, looking for gold that never existed. Bill was thin, tired, and ready to leave this godforsaken place. When Thomas asked him about the cabin, Bill's eyes lit up like he'd just struck gold after all. 12 pesos, Bill said quickly, almost too quickly. That's all I want. 12 pesos and it's yours. Thomas raised an eyebrow. 12 pesos was nothing. He'd paid more for a decent saddle blanket. Something felt off about this deal, but he wasn't about to question his good luck. Maybe Bill was just desperate to leave. Maybe he owed someone money. Either way, Thomas had the coins in his pocket. He counted out 12 silver pesos into Bill's dirty palm. The prospector grabbed them like they were on fire, shoved them into his pocket, and pulled out a rusty old key. His hand shook a little as he handed it over. "It's all yours now," Bill said, backing away toward his packed mule. "Good luck with it." "Wait," Thomas called out. "You got any supplies left inside? Tools or anything?" Bill was already climbing onto his mule. "Didn't leave nothing in there. Cabin's empty, real empty." He kicked the mule and started riding off faster than seemed necessary. Thomas watched him disappear into the desert dust, feeling that uneasy sensation in his gut growing stronger. Why was Bill in such a hurry? And why did he keep looking back at the cabin like it might chase after him? The rancher shook his head. He was being foolish. People did strange things out here in the wilderness. The loneliness and heat could make anyone act odd. He'd heard stories of prospectors who'd gone a little crazy after months alone in the desert, talking to rocks and seeing things that weren't there. He turned his attention back to the cabin. It sat there quietly in the fading light, the Chiricahua Mountains rising up behind it like giant shadows. The location was actually perfect. Close enough to water, far enough from town that his workers wouldn't be tempted to waste their wages on whiskey every night. As Thomas walked closer, leading his horse behind him, he noticed something strange. All the windows were boarded up. But not from the outside like you'd expect if someone was trying to keep vandals out. No, these boards were nailed from the inside. Who boards up windows from the inside and then leaves? The front door had marks scratched into it. Not words exactly, but symbols of some kind. They looked old, worn down by wind and sand. Thomas had seen Apache markings before, but these were different somehow. More deliberate, more careful. He reached for the door handle, and that's when he noticed how quiet everything had become. Out here in the desert, there was always some sound. Wind rustling through brush, birds calling, insects buzzing. But right now, standing in front of this cabin, Thomas couldn't hear anything at all. Even his horse had gone still and quiet behind him, which wasn't like the animal at all. The key felt cold in his hand, colder than it should be after sitting in his warm pocket all day. He slid it into the lock and it turned with a grinding sound that seemed too loud in the silence. The door didn't want to open at first. He had to put his shoulder against it and push hard. When it finally gave way, a smell rushed out that made Thomas step back and cover his nose. It wasn't the smell of death exactly, though he'd smelled plenty of dead cattle in his time. This was different, musty and thick like very old air that hadn't moved in months, mixed with something else he couldn't identify, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The inside of the cabin was dark. With all the windows boarded up, almost no light got in. Thomas could barely see 2 feet in front of him. He stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust, suddenly not so eager to step inside. His horse whinnied nervously behind him and pulled at the reins. Animals knew things that people didn't, his father had always said. Trust what your horse tells you. Right now, his horse was telling him to leave. But Thomas had paid 12 pesos for this cabin, and he wasn't about to let superstition or a bad smell scare him off. He was a practical man. Whatever was causing that smell could be cleaned up. Maybe an animal had gotten in and died. That would explain everything. He took a deep breath of fresh air, held it, and stepped inside. The light from the open door behind him created a long rectangle on the dusty floor. Thomas could see that the cabin was bigger inside than it looked from outside. One large room with a fireplace on the far wall and a loft area above. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust and there were marks in it, patterns that looked almost like someone had drawn designs. As his eyes adjusted more, he started to see shapes in the darkness. A table pushed against one wall, some kind of barrel in the corner, and then, hanging from the main support beam in the center of the room, he saw something that made his blood run cold. At first, his mind couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. It looked like a person, but impossibly tall, suspended in the air. His hand went automatically to the rifle on his back, and he stumbled backward toward the door, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. For a long moment, he just stood there, half in and half out of the cabin, trying to understand what he was looking at. The light from the doorway caught particles of dust floating in the air, making everything look dreamlike and unreal. The figure swayed slightly, turning a little, and that's when Thomas realized with absolute certainty what he'd found. Someone was hanging from that beam. And from the size of them, it wasn't anyone ordinary. This was someone huge, taller than any person he'd ever seen. The body was preserved somehow in the dry desert air, still wearing clothes, long black hair hanging down. Thomas felt his legs go weak. He grabbed the door frame to steady himself. 12 pesos. Bill had practically given this place away, and now Thomas knew exactly why. This cabin wasn't empty at all. It was a tomb. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, his rifle halfway out of its holder, staring at the impossible sight before him. His first instinct was to run, to get on his horse and ride as fast as he could back to town. But something kept him there, rooted to the spot. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the simple fact that he'd spent 12 pesos on this place and needed to know what he'd bought. He forced himself to take slow, steady breaths. His father had taught him that panic killed more men in the wilderness than anything else. Stay calm, think clearly, and deal with what's in front of you. That advice had saved his life more than once when facing angry bulls or rattlesnakes. The figure hung perfectly still now, no longer swaying. Thomas realized there was no wind inside the cabin to move it. That slight movement he'd seen must have been caused by the air rushing in when he opened the door. This person, whoever they were, had been dead for a long time. He took a cautious step forward, keeping his hand on his rifle. The dust on the floor crunched under his boot, and the sound seemed incredibly loud in the silence. Another step, then another. Slowly he moved toward the center of the cabin, giving the hanging figure a wide circle, trying to see it better in the dim light. As he got closer, details started to emerge that made his skin crawl. This wasn't just any body. The person was enormous, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. Their feet, hanging limp in worn leather boots, were almost level with Thomas's chest, and he was a tall man himself at just over 6 feet. The clothes were Apache style, made of tanned leather and decorated with beadwork that had faded with time. The person wore a long deerskin dress, the kind Apache women made, but it was huge, sized for someone far larger than any woman Thomas had ever seen. Long black hair fell past the figure's waist, catching what little light came through the doorway and gleaming dully. Thomas moved around to see the face and immediately wished he hadn't. The dry desert air had preserved the body in an eerie way. The skin had turned dark and leathery, stretched tight over the bones. The eyes were closed, thankfully, but the features were still visible enough to see that this had been a young woman, probably in her early 20s when she died. What struck Thomas most were her hands. They hung at her sides and they were massive. Each hand was nearly twice the size of his own, with long fingers that looked like they could wrap around a man's head. Her arms were thick with muscle even in death. This woman had been strong, incredibly strong. The rope around her neck was tied with knots Thomas had never seen before. He'd tied thousands of knots in his life as a rancher, knew every practical knot there was, but these were different. Intricate, almost decorative, tied with a precision that spoke of ritual rather than rushed violence. He looked up at where the rope was secured to the beam. More strange knots wrapped around and around, far more than necessary to hold even someone this large. Whoever had done this had taken their time. Thomas finally tore his eyes away from the body and looked around the rest of the cabin more carefully. That's when he noticed the circle of stones on the floor directly beneath the woman. They were arranged in a perfect ring, each stone about the size of his fist placed with obvious care. The dust inside the circle looked different, darker somehow, and there were marks scratched into the wooden floorboards. He knelt down to look at the marks more closely, being careful not to disturb the stones. The scratches formed symbols, but not any writing he recognized. They looked old, worn down like they'd been there a long time or maybe walked over many times. Some looked like animals, others like stars or the sun. One symbol kept repeating around the circle, a strange design that looked almost like a handprint, but with too many fingers. A chill ran down Thomas's spine despite the warmth of the day. He'd been in Apache territory long enough to know when something was connected to their spiritual practices. The tribes had their own ways, their own beliefs, and white folks who interfered with those things usually regretted it. He stood up and backed away from the circle, suddenly feeling like he was trespassing on something sacred and dangerous. His boot hit something that clattered across the floor, making him jump. He looked down and saw a small clay bowl that had been hidden in the shadows. It contained what looked like dried herbs and something that might have been corn pollen, though most of it had turned to dust. There were other items scattered around the cabin that he hadn't noticed at first. A bundle of sage tied with leather cord hung from a nail on the wall. More symbols were carved into the doorframe, similar to the ones on the floor. And now that he was looking more carefully, he could see marks on all four walls up near the ceiling, like someone had drawn a protective boundary around the entire room. Thomas had seen enough. This wasn't just a death. This was some kind of ceremony, some kind of ritual that he had no business being part of. The cabin hadn't been abandoned. It had been sealed. Those boards on the windows weren't meant to keep people out. They were meant to keep something in. He moved quickly back toward the door, no longer caring about looking brave or rational. His hands were shaking as he stepped out into the fading sunlight. The normal sounds of the desert rushed back. Birds calling, wind in the brush, his horse snorting and stamping. The world felt real again out here. Thomas took several deep breaths of clean air, trying to steady himself. He looked at the cabin from the outside, seeing it differently now. It wasn't just a rundown shack. It was a prison or maybe a shrine. Either way, it was trouble. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't something he could handle alone, and it definitely wasn't something he could ignore. There were laws in the Arizona territory, even out here in the wilderness. Finding a body meant reporting it to the marshal. But more than that, Thomas needed someone else to see this to confirm he wasn't losing his mind. He untied his horse and climbed into the saddle. The animal was more than happy to leave, practically dancing with eagerness to go. Before riding off, Thomas took one last look at the cabin. In the dying light of day, with shadows growing long across the desert floor, it looked different than when he'd arrived. More sinister, more purposeful. The door was still hanging open, and for just a moment Thomas could have sworn he saw movement inside. Just a flicker, a shadow shifting. His horse saw it too and reared slightly, whinnying in alarm. Thomas didn't wait to see if it was real or just his imagination playing tricks. He turned the horse toward Fort Bowie and kicked it into a gallop. Behind him, the cabin sat in silence, keeping its secrets. The 12 pesos in Bill's pocket were probably the smartest money that Prospector had ever made. And Thomas McCready, rancher and practical man who didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, found himself praying as he rode through the gathering darkness. He prayed that whatever was in that cabin would stay there until someone with more knowledge could come and deal with it properly. Because one thing was absolutely certain in his mind now. That woman hadn't died alone. She'd died as part of something bigger, something important, and disturbing her rest might bring consequences that a simple rancher wasn't prepared to face. The stars were coming out by the time Thomas made camp for the night. Far enough from the cabin that he could convince himself he was safe. But even with a fire burning bright and his rifle loaded and ready across his lap, sleep didn't come easy. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those massive hands hanging limp in the darkness, and those strange symbols scratched into the floor, and that perfect circle of stones that someone had placed with such care. Tomorrow he would reach Fort Bowie. Tomorrow he would tell the marshal what he'd found. But tonight, alone under the desert stars, Thomas McCready wondered if buying that cabin for 12 pesos was the biggest mistake of his life. Thomas reached Fort Bowie just after noon the next day, his horse exhausted and covered in sweat from the hard ride. The fort wasn't much to look at, just a collection of adobe buildings surrounded by a wooden fence, but it represented law and order in this wild corner of the Arizona territory. More importantly, It was where Marshal Clayton Ross kept his office. The marshal was sitting outside the general store, drinking coffee and talking to a couple of soldiers when Thomas rode up. Clayton was in his 50s, with gray hair and a weathered face that had seen just about everything the frontier could throw at a man. He'd been keeping the peace in this territory for almost 20 years, and not much surprised him anymore. But when Thomas told him what he'd found in the cabin, Clayton's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "You're telling me there's a body?" "A woman's body?" "Hanging in that old cabin near the Chiricahua?" Thomas nodded, still catching his breath. "Not just any woman, Clayton. She's huge. 7 feet tall, maybe more. I've never seen anything like it." The marshal set down his coffee and stood up slowly, studying Thomas's face. "You been drinking? Out in the sun too long?" "I'm stone sober and sound of mind," Thomas said firmly. "I know how it sounds, but I'm telling you what I saw. There's a dead woman in that cabin, and she's been there for months at least. Maybe longer." Clayton was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he turned to one of the soldiers. "Go fetch Doc Hendricks. Tell him we need him for official business." He looked back at Thomas. "We'll ride out there this afternoon. Whatever you saw, we need to document it properly." An hour later, a group of 5 men headed toward the cabin. Marshal Clayton and Thomas led the way, followed by Doc Hendricks and 2 deputies, a young man named Pete and an older fellow called Dutch. Doc Hendricks was the closest thing Fort Bowie had to a medical expert. He'd been an army surgeon during the war and had stayed out west afterward, finding he preferred the frontier to city life. The doc was a thin, nervous man who talked constantly when he was anxious. As they rode, he kept asking Thomas questions about what he'd seen, interrupting before Thomas could finish answering, then apologizing and asking something else. The deputies rode in silence, hands near their guns, not sure what they were riding into. When the cabin came into view in the late afternoon sun, the horses started acting strange. They slowed down without being asked, their ears flicking back and forth, clearly uncomfortable. Thomas's horse recognized the place and absolutely refused to go any closer, forcing Thomas to tie it to a tree and walk the rest of the way. "They smell death," Dutch said quietly. "Animals always know." But Marshal Clayton shook his head. "Death that's months old wouldn't bother them this much. There's something else spooking them." They approached the cabin on foot, and Thomas noticed that the door was closed. He'd left it open when he fled the day before, he was certain of it. His stomach tightened with unease. "You closed that door before you left?" Clayton asked, noticing the same thing. "No, sir. Left it wide open in my hurry to get out of there." The marshal pulled his gun and gestured for the others to stay back. He walked up to the door and listened. Nothing. He tried the handle and the door swung open easily. The same smell rolled out, that thick, musty odor that Thomas remembered. Clayton stepped inside, and after a moment he called out, "Sweet mercy." Thomas wasn't lying. "You all better come see this." One by one, they entered the cabin. Doc Hendricks went last, and when he saw the figure hanging from the beam, he made a sound like someone had punched him in the stomach. His medical bag slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a thud. "That's not possible," the doctor whispered. "People don't grow that large. They can't." But the evidence was right in front of them, undeniable and impossible to explain away. The giant woman hung in the center of the room exactly as Thomas had described, her enormous form casting a long shadow in the light from the doorway. Marshal Clayton moved around the body slowly, taking in every detail. He was a careful man, trained to notice things others missed. He pointed at the rope. "These knots. You ever seen anything like this?" Everyone shook their heads. The knots were elaborate, tied with obvious skill and purpose. This wasn't a suicide or a murder done in haste. This was planned, methodical. Doc Hendricks had recovered enough to approach the body, though his hands shook as he pulled out a notebook and pencil. "I need to examine her," he said, his voice steadier now that his scientific curiosity was taking over from his initial shock. "We need to document everything." For the next hour, Doc Hendricks circled the body, taking notes and measurements while the others watched. He had to stand on a chair to reach her neck and check the rope. His face was pale, but his hands were steady as he worked. "She's been dead at least 6 months, he said finally. "The preservation is remarkable. The dry air here, the sealed cabin, it's kept her almost mummified. Her height, based on what I can measure like this, is approximately 6 feet 11 inches. Her hands and feet are disproportionately large, even accounting for her overall size. What could cause someone to grow like that?" Pete asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Doc Hendricks shook his head. There are medical conditions, rare ones, that can cause excessive growth. Gigantism, it's called, but I've only read about it in medical journals. Never thought I'd see a case myself, and certainly not like this. Marshal Clayton was examining the floor, specifically the circle of stones and the symbols carved into the wood. This wasn't just a death, he said. This was Apache, has to be. These markings, that sage on the wall, the way everything's arranged. This was some kind of ceremony. Dutch, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. My wife's people are Mescalero Apache. She's told me stories about their beliefs, their rituals. Some things are sacred. Some things aren't meant for outsiders to see. Well, we're seeing it now, Clayton said. And we need to understand what happened here. Thomas pointed to the doorframe. Look at these symbols. They're on all the walls too, up near the ceiling. And those boards on the windows, they were nailed from the inside. Someone sealed this place deliberately. Doc Hendricks was still taking notes, his pencil scratching rapidly across the paper. There's no sign of struggle. The rope marks on her neck are clean, precise. The knots show no evidence of her trying to get free. He paused, looking up at the body with something like sadness in his eyes. I don't think she fought this. I think she went willingly. The room fell silent at that observation. The implications were disturbing. Why would someone, especially someone young and strong like this woman had clearly been, willingly submit to hanging? Unless she believed in something, Clayton said quietly. Unless this was about faith, about belief in something bigger than herself. Pete had discovered something else. Near the fireplace, hidden in the shadows, he found what looked like the remains of a ceremony. More bowls with dried herbs, bundles of feathers tied together, small carved figures made of wood. Everything was covered in dust but arranged with obvious care. There were people here, Pete said. Multiple people. This wasn't done by one person alone. This was planned, prepared for. Marshal Clayton pulled out his own notebook and started sketching the layout of the cabin, marking where everything was positioned. We need to know who she was. We need to find out if there are any Apache who know about this place, about what happened here. Doc Hendricks was examining the woman's hands now, as much as he could without disturbing the body. These hands, he said almost to himself. The calluses, the way the fingers are shaped. She worked hard. She was strong. You can see the muscle definition even now. Dutch moved to the doorway, clearly uncomfortable being in the cabin. We should talk to the Apache scouts, ones who work with the army. They might know something, Clayton nodded. Good idea. Thomas, you said a prospector named Bill sold you this place? That's right. Gave it up for 12 pesos and couldn't ride away fast enough. We need to find him too. He knows something. Nobody sells property that cheap unless they're desperate to be rid of it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the open door, the men prepared to leave. They documented everything they could, but the cabin's secrets were far from revealed. If anything, they had more questions now than when they'd arrived. What do we do with her? Thomas asked, looking at the hanging figure. It felt wrong to just leave her there. Marshal Clayton considered the question carefully. For now, we leave everything as it is. We don't touch anything until we know more. This might be sacred ground, and if it is, we need to be respectful. They filed out of the cabin and Clayton pulled the door closed behind them. In the fading light, the cabin looked almost ordinary again. Just another abandoned structure in the endless Arizona desert, but now they all knew what it contained, and that knowledge weighed heavy on them. As they rode back toward Fort Bowie, Doc Hendricks kept looking back over his shoulder at the cabin, his mind clearly racing with questions. In all my years of medicine, he said finally, I've never encountered anything like this. This woman, her size, the circumstances of her death, the ritual aspects. It's extraordinary. It's trouble, Dutch said bluntly. That's what it is. We're dealing with something we don't understand, and that's always trouble. Marshal Clayton wasted no time. The morning after their discovery, he sent word to the nearby Apache reservation, asking to speak with Natan, one of the most respected scouts who worked with the U.S. Army. Natan had a reputation for being honest and knowledgeable about both Apache traditions and the white man's world. If anyone could help them understand what they'd found, it would be him. 2 days later, Natan arrived at Fort Bowie on horseback. He was a man in his 40s, lean and weathered, with long black hair tied back and eyes that seemed to see more than most people. He wore a mix of Apache and white man's clothing, practical boots and pants with a traditional leather vest decorated with old beadwork. When he spoke English, it was careful and deliberate, choosing each word with precision. Marshal Clayton greeted him outside the fort. "Thank you for coming. We've found something that we think involves your people, and we need your help understanding it." Natan nodded once. "You said there was a body in a cabin." "That's right, a woman. Apache, we believe, based on her clothing and the items in the cabin. But there's more to it than that. Things we don't understand." The scout's face remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Interest or maybe concern. "Show me." They rode out to the cabin with Thomas and Doc Hendricks. Natan was quiet during the journey, occasionally looking at the landscape as if reading it like a book. When the cabin came into view, he reined in his horse and sat very still for a long moment, just staring at the structure. "You know this place?" Clayton asked. "I have heard of it," Nathan said slowly. "There are stories. Old stories that the elders tell when they want to teach lessons about respect and fear." He dismounted and walked toward the cabin on foot, moving slowly, respectfully, like he was approaching something sacred. At the door, he paused. His hand traced over the symbols carved into the wood frame. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He was either praying or reading the symbols, or perhaps both. "These are protection marks," he said finally. "Very old style. Very powerful. They are meant to keep spirits contained." He looked at Marshal Clayton. "You have been inside?" "Yes, we had to document what we found." Natan's jaw tightened slightly. "That may have been a mistake. But what is done is done. I will look now." He pushed open the door and stepped inside. Thomas and the others followed but stayed near the entrance, giving him space. Natan stood in the doorway for several heartbeats, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. When he saw the figure hanging from the beam, his entire body went rigid. The scout made a sound deep in his throat, something between a gasp and a prayer. He took several steps forward, then stopped at the edge of the stone circle. He did not cross it. For a long time he just stood there looking up at the giant woman, his face showing more emotion than they'd seen since he arrived. "You know who she was?" Clayton asked quietly. Natan's voice was barely above a whisper. "I know the stories. My grandmother told them to me when I was young. Stories of children born different, born big, born strong, touched by the mountain spirits." He pointed up at the woman without looking away. "This is one of them. This is what happens when the spirits touch someone, and the tribe cannot help them." He walked slowly around the circle, being careful not to disturb any of the stones or markings. His eyes took in every detail: the rope knots, the carved symbols, the ritual items scattered around the room. Occasionally he would nod as if confirming something he already suspected. "Her name," Natan said, still circling. "Do you know it?" "No," Clayton admitted. "We were hoping you could tell us." Natan stopped walking and looked at them directly. "If I tell you her name, I give her power. In our way, names are sacred, especially names of the dead. Speaking them can call them back." He paused, considering. "But you have already disturbed this place. You have already broken the seal. So perhaps it does not matter anymore." He took a deep breath. "Her name was Dazi. It means heavy or strong. She was born to the Chiheni band in the time when I was very young, maybe 30 years ago. The stories say she was special from birth, larger than other babies. As she grew, she kept growing. By the time she was 12 summers, she was taller than grown men. By 15, she was as you see her now." Doc Hendricks had pulled out his notebook and was writing quickly, but Natan gave him a sharp look. The doctor stopped, looking embarrassed. "These are not stories for your books," Natan said firmly. "These are sacred things, painful things. I tell you because you have found her, and now you must understand what you have done." "I'm sorry," Doc Hendricks said, putting away his notebook. "I meant no disrespect." Natan turned back to the hanging figure. Dazi was blessed by the mountain spirits. That is what the medicine men said. They gave her great strength. She could carry a full deer across her shoulders without strain. She could lift rocks that 3 men together could not move. The elders said she was meant to be a protector, a warrior woman like the old stories tell of. "That sounds like a gift," Thomas said. "Why would that be a problem?" "Because spirits are dangerous," Natan replied. "Even when they bless you, they are dangerous." As Dazi grew older, the spirits grew stronger inside her. She began to have visions. She would speak in voices that were not her own. Sometimes she would not remember whole days. The spirits were too powerful and her human body could not contain them properly. The cabin felt colder suddenly. though the sun was shining outside. Marshal Clayton crossed his arms, listening carefully. The winter when Dazi was 22 summers, bad things happened to the tribe. Natan continued. 3 children died of fever. 5 hunters disappeared in the mountains and never returned. An elder fell from her horse and broke her neck. Every family lost someone. The medicine men said the spirits inside Dazi were angry. They said she had become dangerous not because she wanted to be, but because the power inside her was too great to control. So they killed her? Thomas asked, unable to keep the horror from his voice. No, Natan said sharply. Not killed. You do not understand our ways. This was not murder. This was sacred duty. He gestured at the cabin. They purchased this place from a white prospector. Neutral ground outside tribal lands. They brought Dazi here and performed the binding ceremony. 3 days of prayer and fasting. 3 days of preparation. Doc Hendricks couldn't help himself. She came willingly? Natan nodded. The stories say she understood. She knew what was happening to her was not natural. She knew the danger she posed to her people. The medicine men gave her sacred herbs to help her spirit separate from her body peacefully. And when the time came, she placed the rope around her own neck and stepped into the spirit world. The men stood in silence, absorbing this information. It was outside their experience, outside their understanding of right and wrong. But looking at the careful arrangement of the ritual items, the precise knots, the respectful way everything had been done, it was clear this had not been a crime of hatred or fear. It had been something else entirely. The symbols on the floor, Clayton asked. What do they mean? They are binding marks. They keep her spirit attached to this place. She cannot wander. She cannot bring harm. Her power is contained here in this cabin until the end of days. Natan looked at them seriously. Or until someone breaks the seal and lets her spirit free. We just opened the door, Thomas said, feeling his stomach drop. Does that mean— I do not know, Natan interrupted. I am not a medicine man. I do not have that knowledge. But I know this. The people who did this ceremony knew what they were doing. They were powerful. They were careful. And they sealed this place for a reason. He walked to the door and looked out at the desert. You should not have bought this land. You should not have opened this door. But you did not know. The white prospector did not tell you. He was a coward and a fool. He should have left this place alone forever. Marshal Clayton joined him at the door. What should we do now? We can't just leave her hanging there? Why not? Natan asked. That is where she chose to be. That is where the ceremony placed her. Moving her now would be the greatest insult. It would be like digging up your Christian dead and throwing them in the river. But it's not right, Doc Hendricks protested, leaving someone hanging like that. Natan turned to face them all. What is right in your world is not always right in mine. Dazi made a sacrifice for her people. She gave up her life so others could live safely. This cabin is her tomb, her memorial. It should be respected as such. The scout moved to leave, but Marshal Clayton stopped him. Wait, are there others who knew her? Who could tell us more? Natan was quiet for a moment. There is one. Old Santiago. He was there at the ceremony. He helped perform the binding. He is very old now, nearly blind, but his mind is still clear. He lives at the reservation. Perhaps he would speak to you, perhaps not. That would be his choice, and would you ask him? Would you bring him here if he's willing? The scout considered this request carefully. I will ask. But I warn you, what you learn may not bring you peace. Sometimes knowing less is better than knowing more. Sometimes the white man's need to understand everything causes more problems than it solves. We need to know, Clayton insisted, if only to know how to put this right. Natan looked back at the cabin one more time, at the dark doorway and the secrets it contained. I will ask Santiago. If he agrees to come. 3 days passed before Natan returned. In those 3 days, word of the discovery had spread through Fort Bowie and beyond like wildfire across dry grass. People whispered in the general store, and ranch hands shared the story around campfires. Some folks wanted to ride out and see the giant woman for themselves, but Marshal Clayton put a stop to that immediately. He stationed a deputy near the cabin to keep the curious away. This wasn't a circus show. Whatever it was, it deserved respect. Thomas McCready couldn't sleep during those 3 days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Dazi hanging in that cabin, felt the weight of those strange symbols, heard the absolute silence that surrounded that place. He found himself thinking about her as a person, not just a body. What had her life been like? Had she been scared? Had she been lonely? On the 4th day, Natan arrived with an elderly Apache man riding slowly beside him on a paint horse. The old man was small, bent with age, his face so wrinkled it looked like dried riverbed mud. His eyes were clouded with the white film of cataracts, but he held himself with dignity despite his obvious frailty. This was Santiago. Marshal Clayton Thomas and Doc Hendricks met them outside the fort. Natan helped Santiago dismount, and the old man steadied himself with a walking stick made from twisted mesquite wood. "Santiago has agreed to speak with you," Natan said, "but we must go to the cabin. He says the spirits there will help him remember clearly, and he will speak in Spanish and Apache. I will translate what you need to know." They made the journey slowly, accommodating Santiago's pace. The old man said nothing during the ride, his clouded eyes seemingly fixed on something in the distance that no one else could see. When they reached the cabin, he dismounted without help, despite his age, and walked directly to the door as if he could see it perfectly. At the threshold, Santiago paused. He began speaking in Apache, his voice stronger than it had been, more certain. Natan translated. "He says he has not been to this place since the ceremony. He thought he would die without seeing it again. But the spirits have brought him back for a purpose. To tell the truth before all the witnesses are gone forever." Santiago entered the cabin and the others followed. When the old man's clouded eyes turned toward where Dazi hung, he made a sound of deep sorrow and tears began rolling down his weathered cheeks. He spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing with his free hand, and Natan worked to keep up with the translation. He says, "Dazi, daughter of the wind, sister of the mountains, I am sorry. I am sorry we could not save you in any other way. I am sorry your strength became your burden. I am sorry that you rest here alone instead of with your ancestors in the sacred grounds." Santiago moved to the stone circle and knelt down with difficulty, his old knees creaking. He placed both hands flat on the floor inside the circle and began speaking again, this time more slowly, more deliberately. Natan translated. "He wants you to understand who Dazi was before the spirits changed her. She was born in 1847, in the time when the Apache still moved freely through these mountains. Her mother was a skilled basket weaver. Her father was a respected hunter. When Dazi came into the world, the midwives were frightened. She was twice the size of normal babies, and her cry was so loud it scared the horses." Santiago continued, and the story of Dazi's life began to unfold. As a small child, she had been gentle and kind, despite her unusual size. While other children played roughly, Dazi was always careful, knowing her strength could hurt others. Her mother taught her to weave baskets, but Dazi's fingers were too large and strong. She would break the delicate willow branches by accident. Her father tried to teach her to hunt, but she couldn't draw a bow properly. Her hands were too big for any weapon they had. But she could do other things, Natan translated. When the tribe moved camp, Dazi could carry loads that required 3 women. When they needed to move a fallen tree, Dazi could lift it alone. When a hunter was injured in the mountains, Dazi carried him back to camp on her shoulders, walking for 2 days without rest. The people loved her even as they feared her. Doc Hendricks was writing in his notebook now, and this time Natan didn't stop him. These were stories that deserved to be remembered. Santiago stood up slowly and moved around the cabin, touching the symbols on the walls as if reading them with his fingers. He spoke of Dazi's teenage years, when her size had stopped growing but her strength had continued to increase. She could bend iron tools with her bare hands. She could throw rocks farther than any man could shoot an arrow. The medicine men came to examine her when she was 15 summers, Natan translated. They performed ceremonies and spoke with the spirits. They said the mountain spirits had blessed her before birth, had given her this strength for a reason. They said she was meant to be a protector, a guardian. They gave her a special name in the sacred language. But that name cannot be spoken to outsiders. It is too powerful. But with the blessings came curses, as they often did with spiritual matters. Dazi began having visions when she was 18. She would see things that weren't there, or see the future, or see the past. Sometimes she would speak in ancient Apache dialects that no one had spoken in generations. How could she know these words? The medicine men said the spirits were teaching her, preparing her for something. Santiago's voice grew sadder as he continued. Natan's translation became slower, heavier. When Dazi was 20 years old, a group of American soldiers attacked a hunting party from the tribe. Many men died, including Dazi's father. She found the soldiers 2 days later. What she did to them, Santiago says he cannot describe. The spirits inside her had taken full control. When she returned to camp covered in blood, she had no memory of what she had done. The medicine men knew then that she was becoming dangerous. The old man moved to sit near the fireplace, exhausted from standing so long. He continued his story, and the pieces of tragedy continued to fall into place. The winter of 1869 was brutal. Food was scarce and sickness ran through the camp. Children died. Elders died. And every time someone died, Dazi would have a seizure, falling to the ground and speaking in voices, sometimes 3 or 4 different voices coming from her at once. The tribe was terrified. Was she causing the deaths? Or was she simply connected to them through the spirits? The medicine men argued for 3 weeks about what to do. Natan translated. Some said she should be sent away alone into the desert to find her own path. Others said she should be kept in a special place, cared for but separated from the tribe. But the eldest medicine man, a very powerful healer, said that neither solution would work. The spirits inside Dazi were too strong. They were connected to the tribe, to the land. Sending her away would not stop their influence. Santiago spoke directly to Dazi's hanging form now, as if she could hear him, as if he was explaining to her one final time. The eldest medicine man proposed the binding ceremony. It was very old magic from before the Spanish came, from before the white men came. It would allow Dazi's spirit to leave her body peacefully while binding the mountain spirits to one location, containing their power. But it required Dazi's consent. It required her willing sacrifice. The old man's voice broke as he continued. Natan's own voice was thick with emotion as he translated. Santiago says, I was there when they asked her. She was in her mother's arms, both of them crying. The medicine man explained what would happen, how it would work, that she would die but her death would save many others. Dazi asked only one question. Will my mother be safe? Will my people be safe? When they told her yes, she agreed immediately. She did not hesitate. She did not ask for time to think. She said, I will do whatever protects my family. Thomas felt his own eyes burning with tears. The cabin suddenly felt heavy with sorrow, with the weight of a sacrifice made decades ago. Santiago described the preparations. They needed neutral ground, so they purchased this cabin from the prospector Bill, paying him well to leave and never return. They brought Dazi here on a night with no moon. 7 medicine men came, including Santiago, who was young then and learning the old ways. They brought sacred herbs, ritual objects, prayer bundles. They sealed the windows from inside, carved the protection symbols, arranged the stones. For 3 days they prepared Dazi's spirit for the journey. Natan translated. She fasted. She prayed. She said goodbye to her mother through the boarded windows. On the 3rd night, they gave her sacred herbs that would separate her spirit from her body without pain, without fear. When the herbs took effect, she was seeing the spirit world already, seeing her ancestors waiting to guide her. She smiled, Santiago says. At the end, she smiled. The old man was crying openly now, and Natan had to stop several times to compose himself before continuing. Dazi tied the knots herself, with the medicine men guiding her hands, teaching her the sacred patterns. She stepped onto the platform they had built. She placed the rope around her own neck. The medicine men sang the binding songs, and Dazi stepped off the platform, releasing her spirit to her ancestors while binding the mountain spirits to this place forever. Santiago stood up, using his walking stick for support. He approached Dazi's body and reached up to touch her foot gently, reverently. News of the giant Apache woman spread faster than anyone expected. Despite Marshal Clayton's efforts to keep the discovery quiet, word traveled through saloons, trading posts, and ranch houses across the Arizona territory. Within 2 weeks, the story had reached newspapers as far away as San Francisco and Denver. Reporters began arriving at Fort Bowie, notebooks in hand, eager to document what they were calling the most remarkable anthropological discovery in the American West. Thomas McCready found himself besieged by visitors. Men in city suits knocked on his ranch house door, offering money to see the cabin. Some claimed to be scientists. Others were honest enough to admit they were just curious. A photographer from Chicago offered Thomas $50, an enormous sum, just for permission to take pictures of Dazi. Thomas turned them all away, but it wore on him. I bought that cabin for 12 pesos, he told Marshal Clayton one evening over coffee. Worst 12 pesos I ever spent. Now I've got reporters camping on my land and people riding out there despite the deputy you posted. One fool even tried to break in through the boarded windows. The marshal rubbed his tired eyes. I've got 2 deputies rotating shifts now, and it's still not enough. People don't understand. They think it's just a curiosity, something to gawk at. They don't understand what Santiago told us. But some people did understand, or claimed to. Doc Hendricks had become obsessed with the case. He spent his days researching medical conditions that could cause gigantism, reading every medical journal he could get his hands on. At night, he would ride out to the cabin and just sit outside staring at it, thinking, "This could change everything we know about human growth and development," he told anyone who would listen. Daisy represents a unique medical case. Her skeleton alone could teach us volumes about the limits of human size. We could learn so much. His obsession worried Marshal Clayton. The doctor had started talking about preservation techniques, about how they might move Daisy's body to a medical facility where it could be properly studied and documented. He didn't seem to hear when people reminded him about the Apache beliefs, about the binding ceremony, about the warning Santiago had given one night. Doc Hendricks did something that would have consequences no one could have predicted. He snuck past the deputy, picking a time when the young man had dozed off in his chair. He entered the cabin with his camera equipment and several notebooks. For 3 hours he worked by lantern light, taking measurements, photographs, detailed notes about every aspect of Daisy's body and the cabin's interior. The photographs came out wrong, every single one. They were blurred in ways that couldn't be explained by equipment failure or user error. In some pictures there appeared to be multiple overlapping images of Daisy, as if she had moved during the exposure, though of course she hadn't. In others, strange orbs of light appeared that hadn't been visible to the naked eye. One photograph showed what looked like faces in the shadows around her, indistinct but definitely there. Doc Hendricks was thrilled by these anomalies. He saw them as evidence of some kind of spiritual energy, something that could be studied and quantified. But when he showed the photographs to others, they felt only dread. The images were disturbing, unnatural. They made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. Worse, strange things started happening around Fort Bowie after the doctor's unauthorized visit. Livestock began dying within a mile of the cabin, not from any illness that could be identified, just falling over dead for no apparent reason. Workers at nearby ranches refused to go near that section of land. They reported feeling watched, feeling a pressure in the air like before a thunderstorm. Even on clear days, one cowhand, a tough man named Red who had worked cattle for 30 years, came into town pale and shaking. He'd been riding fence near the cabin and claimed he saw lights moving inside it, even though it was sealed and the deputy swore no one had entered. Red quit his job the next day and left Arizona, saying he'd rather starve than work anywhere near that cursed place. Marshal Clayton confronted Doc Hendricks. "What did you do in there?" Santiago warned us. "Every visitor weakens the binding. You spent 3 hours inside poking around, disturbing things." "I was documenting an important scientific find," the doctor protested. "We can't just leave her there to rot based on primitive superstitions. This is the 19th century, for God's sake. We're men of science." "Science doesn't explain everything," Thomas interjected. He'd come to town specifically for this meeting. "I've seen the dead cattle. I've heard the stories. Something's changed since you went in there. The cabin feels different now, even from the outside." The territorial government got involved next. Officials arrived from Tucson, concerned about the growing controversy and its impact on relations with the Apache reservation. They wanted the problem solved, preferably in a way that wouldn't anger the Apache population and wouldn't create more sensational newspaper stories. A young bureaucrat named Wilson proposed moving Daisy's body to a territorial museum. "We can give her a proper burial afterward," he said. "But first she should be displayed as part of Arizona's history. People could learn from her. It would be educational." The Apache representatives, including Natan, were appalled. "She is not a museum display," Natan said firmly. "She was a person. She made a sacrifice. Moving her breaks the binding and disrespects everything she did." The debates continued for weeks. Newspaper editorials argued both sides. Some called for respecting Apache traditions and leaving the cabin untouched. Others insisted that scientific advancement and public education were more important than ancient superstitions. The story became a flashpoint for larger arguments about civilization versus primitive beliefs, progress versus tradition. Through it all, Thomas McCready just wanted his life back. He hadn't asked for any of this. He just wanted a line shack for his workers. Now he owned the most controversial piece of property in the territory, and people were arguing about it in newspapers across the country. The situation reached a crisis point one night in early 1892. A group of 5 men, drunk and looking for adventure, rode out to the cabin. They overpowered the deputy, tied him up, and broke into the sealed structure. They wanted to see the giant woman for themselves, maybe cut off a piece of her hair as a souvenir. What happened inside the cabin that night, no one knows for certain. The men were found the next morning, all 5 of them, sitting on the ground outside with blank expressions on their faces. They couldn't speak for 2 days. When they finally regained their voices, they told contradictory stories. Some said Dazzy had opened her eyes and looked at them. Others said the cabin had filled with wind even though the windows and door were closed. One man claimed to have heard voices speaking in a language he didn't understand, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. All 5 men left Arizona Territory within a week. None of them ever spoke about what happened in detail, but they all agreed on one thing. They had felt the presence of something immensely powerful and deeply angry. Something that had been sleeping and was now awakening. After that incident, even the most skeptical people started taking the warnings seriously. Doc Hendricks stopped talking about moving the body. The territorial officials quietly dropped their plans for a museum display. The newspaper reporters found other stories to chase, but the damage was done. The binding that Santiago had described was weakening. People in the area reported more strange occurrences. Unexplained lights in the night. Sounds like wind chimes when there was no wind and no chimes. A feeling of unease that settled over anyone who came near the cabin. Marshal Clayton called a meeting with all the interested parties, territorial officials, Apache representatives, Thomas McCready, and even Doc Hendricks. They gathered in the marshal's office, and Clayton laid out the situation bluntly. "We've got a problem. We all know it. That cabin is becoming more dangerous every day. We need to decide what to do, and we need to decide now. The Apache say moving the body would be disastrous. The scientists want to study it. The government wants it to go away. Thomas here just wants his property back. What's the solution?" The room was silent. Everyone had opinions, but no one had answers. Finally, Naughton spoke up. "There is only one answer. The cabin must be destroyed with her inside it. The binding is breaking. Too many people have disturbed the place. The ceremony must be completed the way it should have been completed in the beginning. Santiago says he can do this, but it must be done soon before the spirits are fully awake." "You're talking about burning her," Doc Hendricks said, horrified. "Destroying irreplaceable evidence." "I'm talking about finishing what was started 22 years ago," Natan replied. "I'm talking about honoring Dazi's sacrifice properly. I'm talking about protecting everyone within 100 miles of that place." The debate went on for hours, but eventually, respect for Apache tradition won out. Perhaps it was the growing fear that something truly dangerous was awakening in that cabin. Perhaps it was the recognition that science couldn't explain everything they'd witnessed. Or perhaps it was simply exhaustion, a desire to be done with this terrible situation. The decision was made. Santiago would perform a closing ceremony. Dazi's body would be removed and taken to a secret location in the Chiricahua Mountains for proper burial with. News of the giant Apache woman spread faster than anyone expected. Despite Marshal Clayton's efforts to keep the discovery quiet, word traveled through saloons, trading posts, and ranch houses across the Arizona Territory. Within 2 weeks, the story had reached newspapers as far away as San Francisco and Denver. Reporters began arriving at Fort Bowie, notebooks in hand, eager to document what they were calling the most remarkable anthropological discovery in the American West. Thomas McCready found himself besieged by visitors. Men in city suits knocked on his ranch house door, offering money to see the cabin. Some claimed to be scientists. Others were honest enough to admit they were just curious. A photographer from Chicago offered Thomas $50, an enormous sum, just for permission to take pictures of Dazi. Thomas turned them all away, but it wore on him. "I bought that cabin for 12 pesos, he told Marshal Clayton one evening over coffee. "Worst 12 pesos I ever spent. Now I've got reporters camping on my land and people riding out there despite the deputy you posted. One fool even tried to break in through the boarded windows." The marshal rubbed his tired eyes. "I've got 2 deputies rotating shifts now, and it's still not enough. People don't understand. They think it's just a curiosity, something to gawk at. They don't understand what Santiago told us. But some people did understand, or claimed to. Doc Hendricks had become obsessed with the case. He spent his days researching medical conditions that could cause gigantism, reading every medical journal he could get his hands on. At night, he would ride out to the cabin and just sit outside staring at it, thinking, "This could change everything we know about human growth and development," he told anyone who would listen. Daisy represents a unique medical case. Her skeleton alone could teach us volumes about the limits of human size. We could learn so much. His obsession worried Marshall Clayton. The doctor had started talking about preservation techniques, about how they might move Daisy's body to a medical facility where it could be properly studied and documented. He didn't seem to hear when people reminded him about the Apache beliefs, about the binding ceremony, about the warning Santiago had given one night. Doc Hendricks did something that would have consequences no one could have predicted. He snuck past the deputy, picking a time when the young man had dozed off in his chair. He entered the cabin with his camera equipment and several notebooks. For 3 hours he worked by lantern light, taking measurements, photographs, detailed notes about every aspect of Daisy's body and the cabin's interior. The photographs came out wrong. Every single one. They were blurred in ways that couldn't be explained by equipment failure or user error. In some pictures there appeared to be multiple overlapping images of Daisy, as if she had moved during the exposure, though of course she hadn't. In others, strange orbs of light appeared that hadn't been visible to the naked eye. One photograph showed what looked like faces in the shadows around her, indistinct but definitely there. Doc Hendricks was thrilled by these anomalies. He saw them as evidence of some kind of spiritual energy, something that could be studied and quantified. But when he showed the photographs to others, they felt only dread. The images were disturbing, unnatural. They made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. Worse, strange things started happening around Fort Bowie after the doctor's unauthorized visit. Livestock began dying within a mile of the cabin, not from any illness that could be identified, just falling over dead for no apparent reason. Workers at nearby ranches refused to go near that section of land. They reported feeling watched, feeling a pressure in the air like before a thunderstorm. Even on clear days, one cowhand, a tough man named Red who had worked cattle for 30 years, came into town pale and shaking. He'd been riding fence near the cabin and claimed he saw lights moving inside it, even though it was sealed and the deputy swore no one had entered. Red quit his job the next day and left Arizona, saying he'd rather starve than work anywhere near that cursed place. Marshall Clayton confronted Doc Hendricks. "What did you do in there?" Santiago warned us. "Every visitor weakens the binding. You spent 3 hours inside poking around, disturbing things." "I was documenting an important scientific find," the doctor protested. "We can't just leave her there to rot based on primitive superstitions. This is the 19th century, for God's sake. We're men of science." "Science doesn't explain everything," Thomas interjected. He'd come to town specifically for this meeting. "I've seen the dead cattle. I've heard the stories. Something's changed since you went in there. The cabin feels different now, even from the outside." The territorial government got involved next. Officials arrived from Tucson, concerned about the growing controversy and its impact on relations with the Apache reservation. They wanted the problem solved, preferably in a way that wouldn't anger the Apache population and wouldn't create more sensational newspaper stories. A young bureaucrat named Wilson proposed moving Daisy's body to a territorial museum. "We can give her a proper burial afterward," he said. "But first she should be displayed as part of Arizona's history. People could learn from her. It would be educational." The Apache representatives, including Natan, were appalled. "She is not a museum display," Natan said firmly. "She was a person. She made a sacrifice. Moving her breaks the binding and disrespects everything she did." The debates continued for weeks. Newspaper editorials argued both sides. Some called for respecting Apache traditions and leaving the cabin untouched. Others insisted that scientific advancement and public education were more important than ancient superstitions. The story became a flashpoint for larger arguments about civilization versus primitive beliefs, progress versus tradition. Through it all, Thomas McCready just wanted his life back. He hadn't asked for any of this. He just wanted a line shack for his workers. Now he owned the most controversial piece of property in the territory, and people were arguing about it in newspapers across the country. The situation reached a crisis point one night in early 1892. A group of 5 men, drunk and looking for adventure, rode out to the cabin. They overpowered the deputy, tied him up, and broke into the sealed structure. They wanted to see the giant woman for themselves, maybe cut off a piece of her hair as a souvenir. What happened inside the cabin that night, no one knows for certain. The men were found the next morning, all 5 of them, sitting on the ground outside with blank expressions on their faces. They couldn't speak for 2 days. When they finally regained their voices, they told contradictory stories. Some said Daisy had opened her eyes and looked at them. Others said the cabin had filled with wind even though the windows and door were closed. One man claimed to have heard voices speaking in a language he didn't understand, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. All 5 men left Arizona Territory within a week. None of them ever spoke about what happened in detail, but they all agreed on one thing. They had felt the presence of something immensely powerful and deeply angry. Something that had been sleeping and was now awakening. After that incident, even the most skeptical people started taking the warnings seriously. Doc Hendricks stopped talking about moving the body. The territorial officials quietly dropped their plans for a museum display. The newspaper reporters found other stories to chase, but the damage was done. The binding that Santiago had described was weakening. People in the area reported more strange occurrences. Unexplained lights in the night. Sounds like wind chimes when there was no wind and no chimes. A feeling of unease that settled over anyone who came near the cabin. Marshal Clayton called a meeting with all the interested parties, territorial officials, Apache representatives, Thomas McCready, and even Doc Hendricks. They gathered in the marshal's office, and Clayton laid out the situation bluntly. "We've got a problem. We all know it. That cabin is becoming more dangerous every day. We need to decide what to do, and we need to decide now. The Apache say moving the body would be disastrous. The scientists want to study it. The government wants it to go away. Thomas here just wants his property back. What's the solution?" The room was silent. Everyone had opinions, but no one had answers. Finally, Naughton spoke up. "There is only one answer. The cabin must be destroyed with her inside it. The binding is breaking. Too many people have disturbed the place. The ceremony must be completed the way it should have been completed in the beginning. Santiago says he can do this, but it must be done soon before the spirits are fully awake." "You're talking about burning her," Doc Hendricks said, horrified. "Destroying irreplaceable evidence." "I'm talking about finishing what was started 22 years ago," Natan replied. "I'm talking about honoring Daisy's sacrifice properly. I'm talking about protecting everyone within 100 miles of that place." The debate went on for hours, but eventually, respect for Apache tradition won out. Perhaps it was the growing fear that something truly dangerous was awakening in that cabin. Perhaps it was the recognition that science couldn't explain everything they'd witnessed. Or perhaps it was simply exhaustion, a desire to be done with this terrible situation. The decision was made. Santiago would perform a closing ceremony. Daisy's body would be removed and taken to a secret location in the Chiricahua Mountains for proper burial with. The closing ceremony was scheduled for a moonless night in February 1892. Santiago insisted on this timing. "Darkness is needed," he explained through Natan. "The spirits must travel in darkness, not light. The moon would confuse them, pull them in wrong directions. We need complete darkness for them to find their way home." In the days leading up to the ceremony, the area around the cabin became even stranger. Birds stopped singing within a half-mile of the place. The air felt thick, heavy, like breathing through cloth. 3 more cattle died on Thomas's ranch, and a wild Mustang was found dead near the cabin with no marks on it, just lying there as if its heart had simply stopped. Marshal Clayton posted deputies in a wide circle around the cabin, not to keep people out this time, but to keep people away from what was about to happen. "This is Apache business now," he told his men. "Whatever you see, whatever you hear, you don't interfere. You understand? We've caused enough trouble already." On the night of the ceremony, a group assembled near the cabin. Santiago was there, of course, leaning on his mesquite walking stick, looking even older and more fragile than before. Natan accompanied him, along with 4 other Apache men, younger but trained in the old ways. They carried bundles wrapped in cloth, ritual items needed for what was to come. Thomas McCready was there because it was his land, and he felt responsible. Marshal Clayton came because he represented the law, even though he knew the law had no jurisdiction over what was about to happen. And despite being told to stay away, Doc Hendricks came too, drawn by guilt and fascination in equal measure. His hand shook as he stood at the edge of the clearing watching. The Apache men began their preparations as the sun set. They built a fire outside the cabin, not with matches but in the traditional way with friction and patience. The fire was sacred, they explained, and had to be borne properly. As darkness fell completely, the fire became the only source of light, casting long shadows that danced and flickered. Santiago spoke to the group in Spanish, so the white men could understand. What happens tonight will be difficult to watch. We will remove Dazi from this place and take her to the sacred mountains where her ancestors wait. Then we will release the spirits that have been bound here for too long. Finally, we will destroy this place so it cannot be used again, cannot trap anything or anyone else. He paused, looking at each person. If you stay to watch, you must remain silent. You must not interfere no matter what you see or hear. The ceremony is delicate. Interruption could be dangerous for everyone. Do you understand? They all nodded, even Doc Hendricks, who looked pale in the firelight. The Apache men entered the cabin carrying torches. Through the open door, the white men could see them moving inside, could hear them chanting in Apache. The words were old, rhythmic, powerful. The sound raised goosebumps on Thomas's arms even though he didn't understand a single word. For over an hour, the chanting continued. Sometimes it would grow louder, more intense. Other times it would soften to barely a whisper. The fire outside seemed to respond to the chanting, flaring up and dying down in rhythm with the voices. Then the wind started. There was no wind anywhere else, just around the cabin. It swirled and gusted, picking up dust and making a sound like distant screaming. The deputies stationed around the area reported later that the wind seemed to be coming from the cabin itself, pushing outward in all directions at once. Marshal Clayton gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles white. Thomas felt his heart hammering in his chest. Doc Hendricks had tears running down his face, though whether from fear or remorse no one could say. The chanting grew louder, more urgent. The wind increased until it was a howl, and then suddenly everything went silent. The wind stopped. The chanting stopped. Even the fire seemed to freeze, its flames motionless for a heartbeat that lasted forever. The Apache men emerged from the cabin carrying Dazi's body wrapped in a blanket woven with sacred symbols. Even wrapped, they could see how large she was. It took all 5 men to carry her, moving slowly and carefully, treating her remains with the utmost respect. They placed her gently on a travois attached to a horse that had been specially blessed for this purpose. Santiago spoke again, his voice tired but satisfied. She is free now. The rope is cut. The binding is released from her spirit. She can go to her ancestors finally. But the spirits that were bound with her, they are still here, still in that cabin. Now we must deal with them. The old man approached the cabin alone, moving with more strength than he'd shown in weeks, as if the successful removal of Dazi's body had given him renewed energy. He stood in the doorway and began to speak in Apache, his voice carrying through the darkness. Natan translated in whispers for the white men. He is speaking to the mountain spirits. He is thanking them for their patience. He is apologizing for the disturbance for the white men who did not understand. He is releasing them from their binding, giving them permission to return to the mountains where they belong. Santiago threw something into the cabin, a bundle that burst into flames when it hit the floor. The fire spread quickly, unnaturally fast, as if the cabin itself wanted to burn. Within minutes, the entire structure was engulfed. As the flames grew higher, reaching into the night sky, the watchers saw something that none of them could explain, and none of them would forget. In the smoke and fire there were shapes, not random patterns that the mind creates from chaos, but definite forms, large human-like shapes that seemed to rise from the burning cabin and move toward the mountains. They were there and then they weren't, visible one moment and gone the next, like heat shimmer on a summer day. The air around the cabin shimmered and wavered, and there was a sound like wind chimes, though there was no wind now and certainly no chimes. The sound was beautiful and sad at the same time, like goodbye sung in a language no living person knew. Thomas McCready, practical rancher who had never believed in spirits or ghosts, watched those shapes move toward the mountains and felt tears on his cheeks. He couldn't explain what he was seeing, couldn't make sense of it with his rational mind, but he knew he was witnessing something important, something sacred. The mountain spirits were going home. The cabin burned for hours, collapsing in on itself, the flames consuming everything. The rope, the symbols, the stones, the ritual items, all of it turned to ash. When dawn came, there was nothing left but blackened earth and the faint smell of smoke. Santiago supervised the blessing of the ground where the cabin had stood. The Apache men scattered sacred herbs, poured water from holy springs, spoke prayers in the old language. When they were finished, Santiago turned to Thomas. "This land is clean now. The binding is broken. The spirits are returned to their home. Dazi rests with her ancestors. It is finished." Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The old man had given him a gift, though it hadn't felt like one through all the trouble and fear. He'd given him knowledge, understanding, a glimpse into a different way of seeing the world. "What do I owe you?" Thomas asked finally. "For the ceremony, for everything." Santiago smiled, showing gaps where teeth used to be. "You paid already. 12 pesos for the cabin. That is enough. You did not know what you were buying, but you treated it with respect when you learned the truth. That is the payment I needed." The Apache men left with Dazi's body, heading into the mountains on paths that only they knew, taking her to a burial place that would remain secret forever. Santiago went with them, and 2 weeks later, Natan brought word that the old man had died peacefully in his sleep the night after Dazi's burial was complete, as if he had been waiting to fulfill this one last duty before he could rest himself. Thomas McCready kept the land where the cabin had been, but he never built on it again. He let the desert reclaim it, let the brush and cactus grow over the blackened earth. Over the years, the exact location became harder and harder to identify. The land healed itself, and the story faded into legend. Doc Hendricks lived with his guilt and his mysterious illness until his death in 1907. On his deathbed, he gave instructions for the items he'd stolen from the cabin to be returned to the Apache people. They accepted them without comment and performed a cleansing ceremony, then buried the items in an undisclosed location. Some things, they said, should remain buried. Marshal Clayton served as marshal for another 15 years. He never spoke publicly about what he'd seen that night, but in private, to people he trusted, he would sometimes say that it had changed the way he understood the world. "There are more things in heaven and earth," he would quote, "than are dreamt of in our philosophy." Thomas McCready lived to be an old man, dying peacefully on his ranch in 1924. In his final years, he would sometimes ride out to the area where the cabin had been. Visitors reported seeing him there, sitting on his horse just looking at the empty desert, as if remembering something important that words couldn't capture. The newspapers forgot about the story eventually. New sensations came along to capture people's attention. The giant Apache woman became a footnote in territorial history, a strange tale that most people assumed had been exaggerated over time. But among the Apache people, Dazi's story lived on. It was told to children as a lesson about sacrifice and courage. It was told to young people as a warning about the price of power.